There are several documented personal stories and reports of vulnerable persons in Canada being offered medical assistance in dying or MAID without requesting it, particularly concerning veterans and individuals with disabilities. Christine Gauthier, a retired corporal and Paralympian, testified to a parliamentary committee that a VAC case manager offered her MAID as an option when she was struggling to get a wheelchair lift installed in her home. At least 5 other veterans reported similar experiences of being offered MAID unsolicited, often when they were seeking help for physical injuries or mental health issues like post traumatic stress disorder or PTSD and suicidal ideation. Other stories involve people with disabilities or chronic illnesses who felt pressured into considering MAID due to a lack of adequate social support, housing, or medical care, rather than as a voluntary choice for unendurable suffering with all options explored. Roger Foley, an Ontario man with a degenerative brain condition, alleged in a lawsuit that he was offered MAID in a hospital as his only option if did not agree to be forcibly discharged to an organization that had previously failed him with adequate home care. An anonymous woman from Toronto chose an assisted death after a failed years-long struggle to find affordable, accessible housing that was free from chemical triggers for her severe environmental sensitivities. Her case highlighted concerns that lack of social resources can drive vulnerable individuals to MAID. Welcome to A Healthy Dose. I'm Julie Stautland, and today we are discussing the policies of MAID and how well safeguards have been put in place to protect vulnerable groups, such as persons with physical or mental disabilities, from heightened risk or inordinate impact. And to help us with that is Alexander Raikin, a visiting fellow in bioethics at the Ethics and Public Policy Center. His writing has been widely cited in major newspapers and academic journals. Welcome, Alexander.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be on.
This is a heavy topic today, but before we get into it, I would like to ask you a little bit about your background and why this became a topic of interest to you.
Well, thank you. First of all, I kind of like to joke around that I'm a recovering Canadian. So I work in Washington, D.C. It is a terminal illness, so I am proud to be Canadian.
Mhm.
But with all the discussion around MAID, I wanted to look into the data. And I wanted to see what is actually being reported and what does the data say about the impact the MAID is having on the vulnerable.
So, talk to me as well. What is CARDIS and how are you associated with the organization?
Yeah, so CARDIS is a Canadian think tank. I wanted my research to be published in Canada. Again, that's the recovery part of Recovery Canadian. So it felt like a natural fit to have this research published through CARDIS. It is a nonpartisan think tank driven by its Christian social mission. I myself am not Christian, but I widely admire their work, and it felt like a good place to write a report for them in Canada.
So, where did you find your sources of information and stats for this report on assisted dying's impact on Canadians with disabilities?
So, Health Canada, there's actually a pretty large problem with MAID reporting. A
Mm.
lot of it is hidden or secretive, and it's very difficult to get good data in regards to MAID. The only data sources that we have publicly are Health Canada and different provinces. So I relied on those reports to collate them and then to compare that with what the Supreme Court of Canada uh, thought was going to happen.
Okay. Now, your report covers from 2019 to 2023. Do you continue to receive information that solidifies your conclusions to this present day, or have there been any recent changes to the policies?
Yeah, so we have the 2024 data that just came out, and the data is even more shocking. So in
Mm.
2016, the first year that MAID was legalized, around 3 Canadians per day died by the hands of their physicians or nurses. Now in 2024, it's closer to 45 Canadians per day.
Oh my goodness. Okay. Well, we're going to stop there, but that is overwhelming, and I did not know that. So stay with us. We'll be talking more about this after the break. In 2015, the Supreme Court of Canada ruled in Carter versus Canada that prohibiting assisted dying violated the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Then in June 2016, Bill C-14 passed, creating the first federal MAID regime, focusing on those with a grievous or irremediable condition where natural death was reasonably foreseeable. Fast forward to March 2021, where Bill C-7 became law, amending the criminal code to allow MAID for those with grievous and irremediable conditions where natural death isn't reasonably foreseeable, and establishing new safeguards. Okay, and all these terms, and I stumble through it trying to say it properly, but hopefully you can help us walk through this. So, what countries did the trial judge look at for consideration of Canada's MAID policies?
So let's first explain just a little bit about how Canada's legal system works, right? So when you first have a trial decision, that's when all the facts are decided. Then if there's a disagreement, that gets appealed. So to an appeal court, and then afterwards it goes to the Supreme Court of Canada if it's appealed again. What the trial judge determined was the trial judge looked at other jurisdictions that have legalized assisted suicide. So at the time, she looked primarily at Oregon, at Washington State. She looked at jurisdictions like Switzerland, like Netherlands, Belgium, and she used that to determine that apparently there was going to be a minimal risk for the vulnerable if euthanasia was to be legalized in Canada. And the truth of the matter is that if you look at the data in Canada now and you contrast that with what was presented, then MAID, as it's currently practiced, would not have been legalized. Canada's data right now is vastly different with the expectations that were laid out. So I'll give you just a brief example. So one of the main data points to prove for the judge's satisfaction that MAID was going to be limited for those who are terminally ill was to look at the percentage of patients who are more likely to survive, who have an actual life expectancy of more than 6 months. So she looked at the data in the Netherlands, which showed that 0.2% of all patients who die for euthanasia at the time were likely to live more than 6 months. Okay, so just 0.2%. The data in Quebec, and I have the latest data from last year, so I hope you don't mind if I look at it. But the
Yeah, go
data
for
in
it.
Quebec is that so the last year in 2024, it was at least 21% of patients had a life expectancy of more than 6 months.
Oh, my
So we
word.
went from a system where the expectation was it was going to be 0.2% to 21%. And remember, this is a percentage. The
Wow.
overall number of patients who are qualifying has increased dramatically, virtually a 16-fold increase between 2016 to 2021. And I mentioned during the break that MAID in Canada is now the 4th most common cause of death if it was recorded as a cause of death by
If it
the
was recorded.
authorities, which is in.
I have to ask you this. Now, I we're not gonna get through all these questions, but what experts did the trial judge choose to focus on primarily? Because if we are having discussion about, okay, how is this being passed? What data are we looking at? What experts are we talking to? How did they choose these particular experts?
Yeah, so this is the part which is frankly infuriating because
Yeah.
what the judge decided to focus on is instead of focusing on disability experts, for instance, Catherine Frazee, who is a Canadian icon. She is a disability activist. She's a professor in disability studies. She has been leading the vanguard for disability accessibility in Canada for the
Mm.
last, I don't know how many decades. Um, Yet the trial judge decided not to listen to her evidence and
Wow.
instead to focus on two physicians, or sorry, I should say one physician, and another, expert who who has a PhD in literature. Um, yes. So instead of focusing
Okay.
on that, and it was looking at this sort of public reporting on euthanasia in other jurisdictions. So instead of listening to Canadians who were telling the judge that their lives were going to be at risk, which we
Yeah.
have the data for right now,
Okay.
instead the trial judge was looking at every other place besides Canada.
I find that greatly concerning myself personally, but we're going to leave it at that. When we come back, we will discuss the impact of MAID on persons with physical disabilities. Stay with us. From 2019 to 2023, at least 42% of all MAID deaths were of persons who required disability services, including over 1,017 persons who required but did not receive these services. MAID providers in Canada have euthanized disabled persons who needed disability supports and were unable to access them, which I find very disturbing. Anyway, we'll go on. I got this information from your report. Talk to me about it.
Yeah, I mean, this is just a shocking statistic. The
Yes.
2024 data, and I have it right in front of me, is that it's virtually the same. Oh, I had right in front of me, but that in the 2024 data, it was the same story, except whereas in the 2023 data, Health Canada reported the number of cases where patients required disability services but were unable to access them before they died from MAID. In 2024, Health Canada decided not to publish that data, citing confidentiality reasons,
Wow.
which is infuriating. But I do want to mention that this data, again, I haven't been able to verify it. It is by Health Canada.
Mm.
And there are large questions over the actual reliability of this data. So I'll give you one example. There's a question for how many Canadians required palliative care services but were unable to receive it before
Right.
dying from MAID. And think about what that means. That vulnerable patients, they need palliative care services according to their MAID providers, and their MAID providers are telling the government after they've already euthanized their patients that they were unable to access this necessary medical treatment for patients at the end of life. Okay. According to Health Canada, the number of people who had that in 2023 and 2024 was very few, just a handful,
Huh.
less than 20, roughly. Yet, if you look at the Quebec data, so just in the province of Quebec, according to the independent board that monitors MAID deaths, just in the province of Quebec, they found that it was roughly 100 patients in both 2023 and another 100 patients in 2024 who
Oh.
required medical services, but were unable to access them before the patient died from MAID.
Wow.
So how is this possible? How is it possible that Health Canada is going to have a vastly different figure, a much lower figure than just the province of Quebec? It
Right.
doesn't make sense.
No.
Yet it is impossible for this to be verified. And what makes this even more infuriating, if you pardon my French, is that Health Canada's data is based off the Quebec data. They
Hmm.
don't do any primary reports. They just rely on the Quebec data. So what is happening here? I
Right.
don't have an answer for that.
Yeah. So, okay. So, what evidence or case studies were accepted, going back to court again here, that in the first place to support the idea that persons with physical disabilities would not be at a heightened risk?
Yes. So the data that was presented to the trial judge and to the Supreme Court of Canada was that there was going to be no Canadians who did not with who there would be no Canadians who would die for euthanasia who only had a physical disability.
Mm.
Zero. That was the evidence base that was submitted, and it was looking at the cases in Oregon. If we look at the data now in the most recent report,
Hmm.
we see that it's roughly more Canadians have died for MAID like in 2024
Hmm.
who either required disability services or the MAID assessors did not know if their patients required disability services before they were euthanized. This is
It's
crazy.
crazy. It is crazy.
It's crazy. How does a MAID assessor not know if the patient that they were killing, and let's be frank of what is happening, does not need disability services? And I
Right.
would mention that the trial judge also explicitly said that MAID assessors would know whether
Hmm.
their patients would have disabilities or not, that they would take into account potential disability status. That is what the trial judge said. That is what the Supreme Court of Canada upheld. And that is exactly what is not happening in Canada, according to Health Canada.
Okay, I'm going to try to quickly read this. How have several bodies of the United Nations responded to Canada's MAID policies? We have a
Canada's turning
half a
into a
minute.
pariah. Yes. So Canada's turning into a pariah in the disability stage. Multiple committees now have warned that what is happening in Canada is discriminatory against disabled Canadians. The response by Canada's Minister of Disabilities, nothing. They have not. The Canada has not responded to the accusations that Canada is systematically discriminating against people with disabilities and endangering their lives.
Wow. When we come back, we will discuss the impact on MAID on persons with mental illnesses. Stay with us. The same psychiatrist who testified in Canada Attorney General versus EF case, who characterized EF's condition as irremediable, despite never having spoken with EF or assessed her either in person or remotely, also claimed to have assessed a patient with anorexia nervosa who would go on to die from MAID as Parliament was deliberating on whether Canada was ready to expand MAID to mental illnesses. MAID on this basis was already happening despite the eligibility criteria prohibiting it. When I read this, I can't believe it, but this is what happened in our country. So, okay, Alexander, this is very disturbing information to me that while Parliament was still deliberating on whether to expand MAID, it was already happening. That's the farthest thing from proper safeguards, in my opinion, at least.
Yeah, I mean, there was also no evidence base behind it. I interviewed eating disability experts in Canada who had no idea that anorexia was a qualifying condition for MAID. And this is even more jarring because supposedly Canada is only going to legalize the expansion of MAID for patients with only psychiatric illnesses next year, next March. And yet, has already been happening for anorexia and for some other psychiatric conditions that lead to like psychosomatic conditions. So this is, I mean, it makes my blood boil
It makes
personally.
my blood boil.
And this is not supposed to. This wasn't supposed to happen.
No.
If you look at patients with depression, that was one of the focal points for like the discussion by the trial judge in Carter.
Okay.
One of the suggestions that the trial judge had was to exclude all patients with depression from potentially qualifying for MAID. That was one of the suggestions that she proposed. In reality, what we're having is that patients with depression and another physical illness, for instance, diabetes or arthritis or
Okay.
hearing loss or vision loss, these are all real conditions that
Seriously.
patients have qualified. And you also have patients with anorexia. We have no idea how many have died in Canada. We just know that some of them have died in Canada. Health Canada has not reported it, and it is happening right now.
It's hard for me to, because I was anorexic, but we'll go on from there. So, okay, so is anything being done with this information? These case studies also found that rapid responses to treat depression led some patients to actually withdraw their request for MAID. Is anything being done with this for these voices that are trying to be heard?
So there is a bill that was proposed that's being debated in the House of Commons to stop the expansion of MAID for just patients with psychiatric conditions. That is still going through Parliament, and there's a chance that it would pass.
Okay.
There was also a legal challenge, a constitutional challenge filed by the largest disability organizations in Canada, challenging Canada's Track 2 status for patients who are not terminally ill. Um, at the same time, though, we have increasing evidence that patients with psychiatric conditions are overrepresented amongst patients who die from MAID. So there was a study that looked at just at a tertiary hospital in Toronto that found that patients with depression were around 40% of those who died through
40%?
MAID at the hospital. So it went from the trial judge suggesting that no patients to now depression being overrepresented. We don't have any of the national data. We could have had that national data, but Health Canada has chosen to not ask MAID providers this question.
Wow. Okay, is there a lack of social supports then, and they are just not being used, or are they just not being used sufficiently or effectively, that we are just pushing this more first?
Yeah, I mean, this is clearly what's happening. The median number of days between requesting MAID and dying from MAID in Canada in 2024 was around 2 weeks. The median number of
Wow.
days for somebody to access a CT scan in Canada was 40 days. This is
Yeah.
crazy that the from orally requesting a MAID death to dying from MAID is just 2 weeks.
Well, it's awful. All right. Thank you so much. We'll have to think on this. While protecting bodily autonomy is held as a Canadian right through the use of MAID as of 2016, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, Section 7 guarantees that everyone has the right to life and security, protecting individuals from state actions that increase the risk of death. For the sake of the vulnerable, we need to carefully scrutinize Canada's safeguards meant to protect against unsolicited MAID or against MAID for the mentally ill. We need to advocate where necessary for better medical or social supports that could save precious lives. Join me next time for part 2 of MAID's impact on Canadians with disabilities here on A Healthy Dose.